Hi, welcome to the second short lecture on Chapter 5. Chapter 5, again, is dealing with images and imagery, and there's a section in this chapter on haiku. I wanted to expand a bit on our book's definition of haiku, and so I've included here a definition from the Haiku Society of America. A haiku is a short poem that uses imagistic language to convey the essence of an experience of nature or the season intuitively linked to the human condition. So we have a short poem that connects an experience of nature or the season with something about the human condition. On the HSA website, there's additional information that I think will be helpful to you in understanding this short poetic form. In English, we typically see haiku written in 3 unrhymed lines. There's 17 or fewer syllables, and this is important because haiku are often thought to be about a syllable count, and in English that's not the case. They usually are simply short poems, 17 or fewer syllables, and in contemporary Japanese haiku, many of them are not written to a syllable count either. In Japanese haiku, you'll find a season word and a cutting word. And the cutting word in Japanese is a kind of spoken punctuation, and it contributes to the syllable count in Japanese, which is another reason why the syllable count doesn't quite equate in the English language. In English, you might find that the season word isn't included at all, and the focus is simply on conveying the images of a particular experience. Usually what we find is the juxtaposing of 2 images or ideas. There might be punctuation that serves the purpose of the cutting word, and haiku usually do not have titles, and I want to emphasize that because our textbook has added titles just using the first line, but they've added titles to all of the sample haiku. Haiku typically do not have a title, and you often will not find metaphors or similes in haiku, and we haven't talked about metaphor and simile yet, but we will be getting to that later this term. I wanted to add another definition here to help us understand what's happening in a haiku poem. Internal comparison. If we juxtapose 2 images, then the internal comparison is the relationship between those images, and it's usually but not always one of similarity. In that relationship between the 2 images, the reader comes to understand the connectedness of things, and that results in an aha moment that's usually present in haiku. There's a moment of awareness when you experience those 2 images happening together and recognize the connectedness of things. So let's take a look at 2 of the poems from the book. The first is by Matsuo Basho, and you'll remember in an earlier lecture I included one of his poems and noted that he is the first master of haiku. This poem obviously was translated from the Japanese. Basho is a 17th century poet in Japan. Heat lightning streak. Through darkness pierces the heron's shriek. This is translated by one of our authors, X.J. Kennedy. So first let's look for the images. We have a visual image of the lightning. We see that against the darkness of the sky. And then we have an auditory image, the heron's shriek. So 2 images that happen at the same time, the heat lightning streak, the heron's shriek. The internal comparison is that both of them are breaking through the darkness in a dramatic way, one visual, one auditory. The second example is by Penny Harder. Broken bowl, the pieces still rocking. In this poem, we have the visual image of the broken bowl, and then we have the image of the pieces still rocking, so movement. The bowl is already broken, one image. The movement of the now separated pieces, the second image. What's the relationship between these two things? What's the internal comparison? If you think about the shape of a bowl and the curve, and then you think about the rocking pieces, it's almost as if even though it's broken, the pieces are still conveying some of that curve. As I mentioned, some of the poems in the textbook they all have titles, which is not typical of haiku, but some of them are also not haiku. And that's simply because haiku in English has changed over the last several decades. Poetic forms change, they grow, poets adapt them. And so I wanted to introduce another Japanese poetic form that's very similar to haiku, and I think this is a more accurate category for some of the poems in the book. This form is called senryu, and this definition is also from the Haiku Society of America. A senryu is a poem structured similarly to haiku that highlights the foibles of human nature, usually in a humorous or satiric way. The website adds notes including that a senryu may or may not contain a season word or a grammatical break. And the important thing here is that sometimes poems could be a senryu or a haiku, and that will depend on the reader's interpretation. So I wanted to take a look at a couple of examples from the book and see whether or not they fit the haiku definition, whether or not they fit the senryu definition. The first one is by Jennifer Brucci. Born again. She speaks excitedly about death. So the first idea in the poem is born again, the idea of being a born again Christian and having the promise of life after death. And the second idea is the person who's been born again is now excitedly talking about death. So there's a kind of irony in the poem that in being born again, the person wants to talk about dying because only through dying are they born again into eternal life. There's definitely humor in this poem, and because concepts like born again, a religious belief, these are human concepts, we see an aspect of humanity, and there's kind of a critique, mostly a humorous portrayal here of the person, and so I would define this particular poem more as a senryu than as a haiku. The second is by Gary Gay. Hole in the ozone, my bald spot, sunburned. Here we have two images, two concepts, two ideas, the hole in the ozone, and the speaker of the poem's bald spot being sunburned. Again, there's definitely humor. The hole in the ozone is parallel with the hole in the speaker's hair, which is the bald spot. You'll even notice that he's used an ellipses, so there are 3 dots, further emphasizing the hole, the bald spot. Now, if we look at this simply as human nature, if humans cause the hole in the ozone, and then there's a sunburned bald spot, this could definitely be categorized as a senryu. However, some of you might read it and argue that if we're talking about the ozone layer and the sun, these are elements of nature, and they're connected to aspects of human nature, the hole in the ozone, the bald spot, and you could make the argument that this is a haiku. So here we have a poem that's clearly a senryu, and here we have a poem that could be defined either way depending on your interpretation and which elements you choose to emphasize. Since you've been working with haiku, having memorized one at the start of the term and then revisited it for our Week 5 forum, why don't you go back and look at your poem again and see what images you find there. Define them. Are they auditory? Are they scent? Are they taste? Are they sight? And then look to see what relationship exists between them.